Secret Service," announced a low, authoritative male voice. "Where do you think you're going?" She turned to see a burly man in plain clothes who briefly flashed a badge of some kind at her, then stuck it back in his pocket, keeping a firm grip on her shoulder with the other hand. "I've got to catch that man," Jean cried, struggling to free herself. "I saw him shoot the president." "You're not going anywhere," the man snapped. "You're coming with me. We want to talk with you." Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription. Today we are continuing our discussion of Jean Hill's book, JFK, The Last Dissenting Witness. Now, she had someone who helped her. Jean Hill is the person who is giving us her account of being the woman in red that was the closest person to Jackie Kennedy when the fatal headshot happened. So a very close witness to the assassination of JFK. And that's why we're reading this book. We will not be reading all of it. We are kind of getting a smattering of her experiences, and then we'll discuss them. One thought that I have today relates to a comment that I got about Jean Hill. Someone in the comments said, she's not necessarily considered the most credible witness. And I would say, no witness is completely infallible. Every witness sometimes, especially in a traumatic incident, might get some details wrong. And in fact, when I went back to listen, there are some, she is one of the people who was interviewed that day and thereafter. So there are interviews you can watch on YouTube. There are oral histories that places like the 6th Floor Museum have done with her. So you have ample opportunities online to hear her voice, to see her face, and to get her account somewhat for yourself from her own lips. I will say, the accounts that she gave that day, and she'll get into it, I believe, in our readings today, she actually mentioned a little dog. And it's very, very odd. But I think it's one of those times when you're in the moment and there's something that's happening that you can't make sense of, you insert something familiar. And she has said that she just had this picture of like famous rich people who travel with a little dog. And there was some moment during the motorcade when she glanced up and she saw both Jackie and Jack looking down at something in the seat between them. It's possible it was the bouquet of roses that had been given to Jackie. We know that in the moments prior to the shooting, the things that had been said were about how kind the people of Dallas had been to the Kennedys when that wasn't expected. And the governor's wife even said something along the lines of, "You can't say that the people of Texas don't love you, Mr. President." And he remarked very similar. And so it's possible it had something to do with the bouquet. Maybe they just both happened to glance down at the same time, but she thought that they were laughing or looking at a dog between them. And so in at least two of her interviews that day, she mentioned a little dog between them. So I don't know what that was. An interesting brain blip. But I'll just say at the beginning that her testimony is not infallible. However, she is a witness to this event and she has written her account. So the reason why we are reading an account like this, even if we know that her account is not infallible, is because of things like this graphic that I'm showing right now. There are times when, yes, the odd random thing like a little dog gets thrown into a person's insights, and it's like, okay, that's not real. That's not reality. If there were 40 people who mentioned a little dog, then we would go, wait a second, there must have been a little dog because that many people can't be wrong. But she's just one, and that's what her own brain did to make sense of a momentary situation. But this graphic shows the way that tons of observers who saw the president's body, these are, I believe, all medical examiners and medical observers like in the emergency room that day in trauma room 1 that all noticed a large exit wound on the back of the head, and they're all pointing to the same exact phenomenon, which doesn't show up in the autopsy photos, of course. But this image is taken from the documentary Destiny Betrayed, which is a fantastic documentary from 2023 about the JFK assassination. So I will link to that in the comments, but I just wanted to give you this graphic and say, any one of these observers who are telling us about this wound might get one tiny detail wrong. Maybe they put the wound hole here and it was actually here. But when everyone is pointing to this one thing, we pay attention to it. And so that's my goal. As we read through several different resources, hopefully over time we will see patterns develop of eyewitness testimony and behaviors that were observed, or actions or outcomes that were observed, and we can make good models for what we believe might have been true based on an abundance of witnesses. So that's the goal, not that we get every single word of hers verifiably true. So we meet Jean Hill at the Grassy Knoll wooden fence. That's, remember, where she moved through the chaos and hysteria, throngs of panicked people, to get to the fence. When she finally managed to reach the wooden barrier and ran behind it, she found herself in a parking area. She looked back at the point from which she thought the shots had come and saw a single uniformed policeman whom she did not recognize. Remember, she's been dating a police officer, and she used those connections to get into the unpopulated triangle area that she had been standing. So she has a connection to the Dallas Police Department. She knows many of the young men, and she doesn't recognize this one. The policeman seemed to be guarding something. She noticed what looked like a rifle in the policeman's hand, and something far in the back of her mind told her to wonder why. None of the other officers she had seen was carrying a rifle. Why should this one be? And why should he be back here behind this fence? She had no answers for her questions, but as quickly as they formed in her brain, another part of her mind was telling her to disregard them. This was, after all, a policeman, an inner voice of reason said. His uniform and badge were symbols of law and order, and policemen were supposed to have guns, even rifles sometimes. Policemen were there to protect public figures and private citizens alike. And policemen didn't shoot at the President of the United States, not from behind wooden fences or anywhere else. Did they? Confused and breathless, Jean whirled away, her eyes frantically combing the plaza in search of either the man she now thought of as the shooter or the other man she had seen running toward him. Then, without warning, she heard a movement behind her and felt a hand clamp down on her shoulder in a numbing, vice-like grip. "Secret Service," announced a low, authoritative male voice. "Where do you think you're going?" She turned to see a burly man in plain clothes who briefly flashed a badge of some kind at her, then stuck it back in his pocket, keeping a firm grip on her shoulder with the other hand. "I've got to catch that man," Jean cried, struggling to free herself. "I saw him shoot the president." "You're not going anywhere," the man snapped. "You're coming with me. We want to talk with you." "Leave me alone," she howled, now on the verge of tears. "Don't you understand? I've got to go catch this man. They're getting away." For one brief moment, she managed to break free, but before she could take more than 2 or 3 running steps, she was restrained by a second plainclothesman, whose grip on her other shoulder was even stronger than the first's. "You'd better be still if you know what's good for you," he warned, as she slumped helplessly between them. Unceremoniously, the second man jammed his hand into her coat pocket and deftly withdrew the handful of still damp Polaroid prints she had deposited there a few minutes before. "What are you doing?" Jean demanded. "Those are my pictures. Just who do you think you are?" "We know who we are," the man said roughly, shoving the pictures into his own jacket pocket. "The question is, who are you? That's what we are going to find out. So just start walking and keep smiling, just like we are all real good friends. Otherwise, you're in big trouble." Jean Hill never saw the pictures again. She never found the man with the gun either, but she can close her eyes today and see him with the same distressing clarity as she could see him then. The sinister shadow, the muzzle flash, the sharp crack of the shots. the president's head exploding. Jackie screaming, the running figure in the brown coat. JB's motorcycle turning and turning. And although it is only a movie in 1991, the ongoing nightmare that began with those sounds and images is all too real for Jean Hill. It remains as real today as it was on that disastrous November afternoon in 1963. As real as the shooter behind the fence. The rest of that afternoon and evening seemed to stretch into an eternity for Jean. She was herded into a third-floor interview room in the Dallas County Criminal Courts building, directly across Houston Street from Dealey Plaza. I will put up a map. It's important that we keep straight how close all of these things are. And by the time she found her way back into the outside world, she would feel as if she had been held captive for days. At first, she had no idea what had happened to Mary. Remember, she and Mary had watched the assassination together. The last time Jean had seen her, Mary was still hugging the ground in the Grassy triangle. Jean had gone back to try to get Mary to come up with her to the Knoll, but Mary refused. The two men representing themselves as Secret Service agents quickly turned Jean over to two other interrogators who sat staring out through some windows overlooking Dealey Plaza. These men made no effort to identify themselves, but they neither looked nor acted like local officers, and Jean assumed that they were federal agents of some kind, although there was no way to know for sure. At first they were friendly and almost apologetic for detaining her, but they soon adopted a more menacing mood. They kept pecking away at her with the same probing, repetitive questions until she wanted to scream. "Why did you come here today? Why were you in the street just before the shots were fired? How many shots did you hear? Where do you think they came from? Why did you run up the hill? What do you think you saw?" From the beginning, they seemed to want to hear answers that were impossible for her to give, and they made their displeasure evident when the right answers were not forthcoming. The more wrong answers she gave, the more hostile they became in their questioning, but there wasn't the slightest doubt in Jean's mind about what she had seen. And even in these increasingly unpleasant circumstances, she clung steadfastly to her story. The constant badgering made her angry and a little belligerent, but it in no way diminished the clarity or the terrible impact of what she had witnessed. "I'm telling you, I saw somebody shooting at the president," she told them again and again. "He was standing behind the wooden fence at the top of the Grassy Knoll." The top of the what? The Grassy Knoll. Jean didn't realize it at the time, but she now believes she may have been the first person to use this term to describe the now famous hillock in Dealey Plaza. "Well, you don't know what you're talking about," she was told sternly. "You couldn't have seen any such thing." "How do you know?" she flared. "Look, Mrs. Hill, you're only making trouble for yourself if you persist in this story." "I know what I saw," Jean persisted. "I don't think you do," the interrogator growled. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll keep quiet about it. It would be very foolish of you to ever repeat what you're saying outside this room." Jean knew she could not possibly be the only eyewitness to be questioned by the authorities and wondered why she was the only person in the interview room. In point of fact, other witnesses who were also at the criminal courts building that afternoon included Gail and Bill Newman, who had covered their two small children with their bodies when the shots were fired. I believe they were across the road from where Jean and Mary were standing. They were also interviewed on local news channels, and you can see their interviews and their descriptions. Maybe it's just a local interviewer, but they have their children and they're like pacifying them in real time having this interview. It's pretty fascinating. And Charles Brem, who had seen part of Kennedy's skull fly to the left rear of the limousine when the fatal bullet struck. Jean would become well acquainted with some of these witnesses later, but at the moment she had no idea who any of them were, and they were not allowed to compare their accounts of the assassination during the course of the afternoon. She wished desperately that she could somehow get in touch with J.B. Marshall. This is the man that she had kind of been romantically attached just before the assassination, who was a police officer. But she knew that was next to impossible. Adding to her uneasiness and frustration was the fact that J.B. was scheduled to leave on a 10-day deer hunting trip as soon as his shift ended that afternoon. Because of the assassination, he might not be able to go, since all police leaves might be canceled. but she was anxious to talk to him, and the thought of having to wait for 10 days was almost more than she could bear. The questioners returned then, breaking into her thoughts and starting the interrogation all over again. "Did you see a bullet hit the ground near you?" she was asked. "Not that I remember. Why?" "Then what made you jump back from the president's car so suddenly?" "I just realized that I shouldn't touch it, that's all." "What were you doing out in the street in the first place?" "I was trying to get him to turn toward me." "Who?" "President Kennedy." "Why?" "So Mary could take his picture, but just as he turned, the first bullet hit him." "How many shots did you hear?" "I'd say at least 4 to 6, maybe more." The man stared coldly at her for a moment. "That's ridiculous. You had to be hearing echoes, not shots. We can account only for 3 bullets, and that means there were only 3 shots maximum. The evidence showed they were all fired from a window in a building overlooking the site, not from this grassy knoll of yours." "All I know is I heard more than 3 shots, and at least one of them came from behind the fence at the top of the knoll." "Why are you treating me this way, like I'm a criminal or something? Why do you keep asking me these questions if you don't want to hear my answers?" "Because your answers are wrong and potentially dangerous," the interrogator said. "They'll only confuse matters, and they could cause you a lot of grief if you aren't careful." He shook his head in disgust and disbelief. I will say she is describing a lengthy time where they asked her questions, went away, came back. This contrasts with the interview that she did with Mary Mormon that same day. There's an interview on 11/22 where she's talking about this interrogation. So I just want to let you know where I see some, things that could adjust how seriously we take these things. So she is asserting she heard many shots. She is asserting she saw a man behind the fence, and that when she went there, there was a man in a police uniform holding a rifle, and at least 2 plainclothesmen grabbed her and in some way indicated she needed to get to the criminal courts building, and that's where she went. So I just want to highlight for us, those are some of the key points. But she's writing this in 1991, I believe. So 28 years after the fact. So we have to keep that in our minds and go, is she giving us a word for word? Is she inserting things further back than they could have been known? For example, I don't know that they would have given her the information that there are 3 bullets, because I'm not sure that they would have, unless there's some sort of active conspiracy. But that's an example of something that could be retroactively inserted into this that she's just communicating to us. So, while Jean considered herself a virtual prisoner in the small interview room, all sorts of media people were apparently roaming at will among the law enforcement officers, federal agents, and witnesses in the building. And when she was taken downstairs to the sheriff's office and finally re-encountered Mary in the process, reporters and TV cameramen swarmed around the 2 women like flies. So I know there's at least 2 interviews of her that day. I would love, if you guys find more, feel free to link them below. I will try to do the same, but that way we can collect information about Mary and Jean here. It should be noted, and Jean readily admits, that Mary's recollections of the period immediately after the shooting do not necessarily coincide with Jean's own. Differences exist in their recollections of when and where they were reunited following Jean's run up the Knoll. That does feel important. One of the reporters introduced himself as Jimmy Darnell, a newsman for WBAP, which is still Channel 5 NBC affiliate for DFW, for Dallas-Fort Worth. The network's pressing us to get some statements from eyewitnesses about the assassination, Darnell told Jean. "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions, ma'am?" To Jean, the newsman's polite, soft-spoken approach was a pleasant contrast to the abrasive manner of the interrogators in the upstairs interview room. Brash, headstrong, and feeling rebellious at the time, as well as being a little wild by her own admission, Jean conveniently forgot those interrogators' grim warnings not to repeat her story outside that room. And in doing so, she made what she now concedes was a terrible error in judgment. "No, I don't mind," she said with a shrug, "as long as you promise not to call me a liar like everybody else I've talked to this afternoon." Jean would not see or hear into any of the television interviews she granted that afternoon for almost 25 years. That's crazy, but with the internet I'll put out this video and then it'll be there. My husband and I were just talking the other day about how it's possible our grandchildren might hear some of these videos and interact with me as I am now, but when I'm an old lady to them, or even after I've passed. But she didn't have anything like that. She gave her interviews. They were seen that day by people all probably around America, or at least around Dallas, and then forgotten. And so, 25 years later, she gets to hear some of these things. But they would be broadcast to countless millions of other Americans within a few minutes. Jean's voice-only interview with Jimmy Darnell was the very first eyewitness account of the assassination to be carried by NBC News that afternoon. And an hour or so later, the network followed up with on-camera interviews for both Jean and Mary. These were the only eyewitness interviews presented by the network during the first hours of its continuous coverage of the assassination. The damage that would later cause Jean unlimited regret was done almost immediately at the beginning of the first interview. "Could you give me your name and address, ma'am?" Darnell asked. "I'm Jean Hill of 9402 Bluff Creek in Dallas." She gave out her address. "That's 9402 Bluff Creek?" "That's right." It all seemed so inconsequential at the time. Only amid the agony that was to follow did Jean realize the import of what had happened. Her address had been broadcast not once but twice on nationwide television. In essence, Jean Hill had suddenly become public domain. This was like, doxing before there was doxing, before there was the internet. Accessible to anyone who was curious enough or hostile enough to seek her out. And after the bizarre story of what she claimed to have seen that day was also aired, there would be plenty of the curious and the hostile alike. The doorway to trouble, in the form of threatening letters, crank phone calls, midnight prowlers, and all manner of unwelcome intrusions had been left wide open. That was only the start of it. In addition to the dozen or so news people whom Jean encountered that afternoon, she would soon be contacted by reporters from all three major U.S. networks and the British Broadcasting Corporation, none of whom had the slightest trouble locating her for obvious reasons, and asked to elaborate on her story. It's interesting to hear this because there are witnesses who still in the 90s and the aughts were being tracked down by researchers who had basically disappeared into the ether. They had been mentioned, maybe a detail or two about them, but then because there was no internet or follow-up, they went decades of their lives without follow-up, and many of them were not called to the Warren Commission. One that comes to mind is the woman named Victoria that was on the stairs in the school book depository immediately following the assassination. But she happened to be one that was reachable because of her address. Long before the storm of publicity died down, all hope of future privacy, security, and peace of mind had died for Jean. While she was in the sheriff's office, she was also asked to give a deposition detailing what she had witnessed, but Jean maintains that she was merely handed a blank form and told to put her signature on it. Later, she says the same information that Mary had given was merely repeated on Jean's deposition form, and she was never given an opportunity to read it at the time. This has led a number of people to question the authenticity of Jean's account of the afternoon, since no mention is made in the deposition of her being taken forcibly to the criminal courts building, and the impression is left that she, Mary, and reporter Jim Featherston of the Dallas Times-Herald came to the building together. So that calls into question and is important for us to tuck away as a piece of how we view this evidence, that it wasn't mentioned at the time, her deposition doesn't mention it, and Mary's recollection varies. And so that does put a question on whether or not this forcible bringing to the criminal courts building for interrogation actually happened at all. In the bedlam following the shooting, Mary had already allowed Featherston to take possession of her only remaining Polaroid picture. It would be published in the Times-Herald that weekend, along with an article based on Featherston's interviews with Jean and Mary. Later, the surviving photo would also be distributed to papers everywhere by the United Press International and would become perhaps the single most widely published still photograph to capture the act of the assassination. It clearly told a graphic, gruesome story. President Kennedy was still upright and in the act of slumping toward Jackie, and a white helmeted J.B. Marshall and part of his motorcycle were clearly visible in the foreground. The photograph also showed the expanse of wooden fence at the crest of the grassy knoll, and at almost the same spot where Jean had seen the shadowy figure of the shooter, a fuzzy, indistinct form of some kind was barely visible. It wasn't actually identifiable as a person, but merely as something that seemed not to belong at that particular spot. Later, when Jean saw the photograph, she became more convinced that the strange shape behind the fence could actually be the shooter himself. By shortly after 4 p.m., news vendors in downtown Dallas were getting up to $10 per copy for the edition of the Dallas Times-Herald carrying details on the arrest of a suspect named Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee of the Texas School Book Depository who was to be charged with both the murder of President Kennedy and the fatal shooting of Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit. Police had evidence that Oswald fired the fatal shots at the motorcade from a sniper's nest on the depository's 6th floor. On an inside page in the front section, the same edition also carried the reproduction of Mary's Polaroid picture and the story on Mary and Jean. Standing in the street at the triangle west of the Houston and Main Street intersection, the story read, Jean Hill of 9402 Bluff Creek and her companion were eyewitnesses to the shooting of President Kennedy in Dallas on Friday. Both heard a sequence of shots, saw the president slump over toward his wife, heard the piercing scream of Mrs. Kennedy. They glanced up to see a man run up the hill across the street from them. Parenthetically, it adds, like many of the accounts published during those frantic hours following the assassination, the story was not totally accurate. Mary Mormon had never claimed to see either, quote, the shooter behind the fence or the running figure of the man in the brown coat. It was only Jean who had made this assertion. That's the end of the parenthetical portion. The report included this quote from Jean, who had been close enough to hear Jackie Kennedy's words distinctly at the moment the president was hit. Then the president looked up, and just about that time he grabbed himself across the chest and looked like he was in pain. He fell toward Jackie across the seat. She, Mrs. Kennedy, said, "My God, they've shot him," and she fell across him. I would say about 6 shots rang out, and everybody started screaming and falling down. That's the end of the quoted section. Neither Jean nor Mary saw that edition of the Times-Herald that evening, and apparently neither did any of the agents and officers who were questioning them, which was fortunate. Otherwise, the interrogation might have gone on all night. Over the next few hours, circumstantial evidence steadily mounted against Oswald, who was being interrogated a few blocks to the east at the Dallas Police Department. In addition to the 3 spent cartridges found in the sniper's nest, officers had also found a rifle with Oswald's palm print on it in the school book depository. I just want to pause and say, no, they didn't. There were no prints accessible on it. They brought in a prints expert who could find nothing. The gun had been wiped clean. It wasn't until several days later that all of a sudden they announced they had a palm print, and it is like a full palm print. And the mortician in charge of Lee Harvey Oswald's body gave the account that officials came to him. He wasn't sure if they were FBI or Secret Service, that they had some number of up to an hour, minutes up to an hour with Oswald's body alone, and that they knew that they printed him because he spent a lot of time after their visit cleaning off Oswald's hands from all the ink. So he was the one who had taken care of the body. So they did not have Oswald's prints on, and then the next day the print was magically found on the rifle. So there is good reason to believe that the palm print only came multiple days after, and that this is just an inaccurate writing in this particular book. The concept of a lone assassin, which would subsequently blind the Warren Commission to masses of contradictory testimony and hundreds of unanswered questions, was already entrenching itself in the minds of law enforcement authorities. But for some of them, Jean believes, the concept may have been there all the time. As the emphasis shifted to Oswald, the officers at the criminal courts building gradually seemed to lose interest in Jean and Mary. Finally, after they had been left alone for more than an hour and seemingly forgotten, the 2 women simply walked out of the courts building and kept going until they got to the car. Nobody actually gave them permission to leave, yet nobody tried to stop them either. It was after 9 p.m. as they hurried the 2 blocks down Houston Street where they had parked Mary's 1961 Thunderbird that morning, crawled wearily into the car, and headed straight home. Could it possibly have been only 8 or 9 hours since all this began? Jean asked herself disbelievingly. At the moment, Jean was more concerned about her 12-year-old son Billy and her 10-year-old daughter Jeannie than anything else. Although she had a standing arrangement with a neighbor to care for the children after school if she wasn't home, she had never expected to be this late. And she had not even been able to get to a telephone to call and explain the situation. She also felt emptiness and disappointment at realizing that JB had probably left town without knowing of her problems and would not be back until a week from Sunday. As the T-Bird glided east through a stricken and grieving Dallas, a sense of unreality seemed to hang in the very air. Jean was worried, exhausted, and sick at heart, but she was also relieved that the most traumatic, unsettling incident she had ever experienced was finally over. Mercifully, she could not know that the calamitous events of today were merely a prelude to what lay ahead. The greatest ordeal of Jean Hill's life had barely begun. Next time we will read the shock and the aftershock. So we will meet Jean as she wakes up the morning after the assassination and some terrifying events that take place in her life. Again, right now we are reading word for word most of the book. That will not continue. We will pick bits and pieces from here on out so that you get a sense of the rest of Jean Hill's account before we move on to a different witness. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments what stands out to you. Let me know what you do with the little details, like that she mentioned a little dog or that she and Mary have differing accounts of what happened. Very interesting. It makes you wonder about edited memories, whether or not she, fully noticed at the moment or later was saying, well, yeah, that could have been. I'd love to know your thoughts about what's going on with Jean Hill in the comments. Let me know and we will discuss that there. Have a great day. Bye.